Winter sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling city of Los Angeles, where skyscrapers pierced the morning mist like silent sentinels of ambition. Among them stood one of the most luxurious penthouses in Beverly Hills. Home to Richard Hale, a man whose name carried weight in every financial circle in the state. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of success. Polished, powerful, untouchable. But beneath the marble floors and the gleaming chandeliers, his empire was colder than the frost on his window pane. That morning, Richard stood in front of a massive glass wall, sipping black coffee, watching the city pulse beneath him. The faint reflection of his tired eyes stared back. Eyes that had seen too many deals, too many betrayals. Behind him, a maid dusted the edge of a glass sculpture, moving quietly, almost invisible. He barely noticed her. But the quiet was broken when the heavy oak door creaked open. Dade. Richard turned. Standing there was a young man, Ethan Hale, his only son. 19, thin but with that same determined jawline his father once had. His clothes were simple, his hair slightly messy, and in his eyes lived something Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Sincerity. "What is it, Ethan?" "I'm busy," Richard said without looking up from his phone. "I just wanted to talk," Ethan said cautiously. "About the shelter project. I was thinking, maybe we could fund it this year." "You promised last time." Richard sighed heavily, setting his phone down. "Ethan, I already told you. That's not how business works. You don't just throw money at every sob story that crosses your path." "But they're not just stories," Ethan pressed. "There are real people suffering out there. You have so much. You could change everything for them." The maid froze in place, glancing nervously between father and son. She'd seen this tension before. Heard the same conversation echo down the halls more times than she could count. Richard's tone hardened. "Nuff, Ethan. You don't understand the world yet. When you build something from scratch, when you fight for every cent, you'll learn that pity doesn't build empires." Ethan's voice trembled. "Then maybe I don't want an empire, Dad. Maybe I just want to help people." Silence. The words hung in the air like a dagger. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're being ungrateful. You've lived your entire life in comfort because of what I built." Ethan's shoulders slumped, but his eyes burned with quiet defiance. "Then maybe that comfort isn't worth it." Before Richard could respond, the butler entered the room. "Sir, Mr. Cooper is here for the investment meeting." Richard turned back toward the city. "We're done here," he said coldly. "Go to your room. Or go out. Just don't waste my time with childish fantasies." Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps fading down the long hallway of a home that suddenly felt more like a museum than a family. Hours passed. Richard buried himself in meetings, calls, and numbers. His world reduced to profits and projections. But that night, as the lights of Los Angeles shimmered below, something unsettled him. The penthouse was too quiet. Ethan hadn't come home. He tried to brush it off. Teenage rebellion, he told himself. He'll be back, he always is. But by midnight the unease turned into a knot in his stomach. He called Ethan's phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. The next morning, the maid entered the study with trembling hands. "Sir, there's something you should see." She handed him a tablet with a video playing on it. Richard squinted at the shaky footage. It looked like security camera footage from one of his own buildings downtown. In the video, Ethan was standing outside the Hale Industries office tower. FEDTHNGRY, Nenoroti around him, people were laughing, whispering. Some security guards approached. One of them, large, uniformed, grabbed Ethan by the arm. Richard's blood ran cold as he saw what happened next. They threw him out. Literally. Pushed him onto the pavement like some trespasser. His son. Ethan tried to stand, his lip bleeding. As people recorded on their phones. The guard shouted something inaudible, but the message was clear: you don't belong here. The video ended with Ethan limping away into the street, clutching the torn sign. Richard stared at the screen, his hand trembling. "When was this?" he demanded. "Yesterday afternoon, sir," the maid whispered. The guards said they didn't recognize him. They thought he was one of those protesters. Richard's voice cracked. "My son, they threw out my son." His coffee cup fell, shattering on the marble floor. For the first time in years, Richard Hale, the man who controlled millions, felt utterly powerless. He grabbed his coat, his heart pounding, and stormed out of the penthouse. His chauffeur tried to speak, but Richard didn't hear him. The cold wind of the city hit his face as he drove himself for the first time in years, searching every street, every alley. Hours later he found what he feared most. On a quiet corner, near an old diner, Ethan sat alone on the curb, holding a paper cup of coffee someone had bought him. His clothes were dusty, his eyes tired, but there was still that spark of kindness in them. Richard froze at the sight. His son, the boy he'd raised in luxury, looked like a stranger, a servant, a beggar. He stepped out of the car slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Ethan." The boy looked up. For a second, their eyes met. And in that single moment, everything Richard thought he knew about power, wealth, and love began to crumble. "Dad," Ethan said softly. "What are you doing here?" Richard couldn't answer. His throat closed up as guilt clawed at his chest. Because for the first time, he realized he wasn't the man his son needed. He was the reason his son was broken. For a long moment, neither father nor son moved. The city buzzed around them. Horns blaring, people rushing past. But time itself seemed to have stopped on that cracked sidewalk. Richard stood a few feet away, his tailored coat looking almost absurd amid the peeling paint and flickering streetlight. Ethan's eyes were hollow, guarded. The space between them felt like 1,000 miles of broken promises. Richard took a hesitant step forward. "Ethan, get in the car. You shouldn't be here." Ethan stared at him. "Why?" "Because I embarrass you." His voice was low, steady. "You already had me thrown out of your own building, Dad. What's left to protect?" Richard's chest tightened. "You think I told them to do that? You think I'd ever?" He stopped himself. The words sounded weak even to his own ears. Ethan turned away, pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself. "You built a world so high above everyone else that even your own son can't reach you. What did you expect?" "I didn't know," Richard said, his tone cracking. "If I had." Ethan cut him off. "If you had, what? You'd have told them to be gentler when they kicked me out. You don't even know how your empire treats people, Dad. Because you stopped seeing people a long time ago." The sting in his words hit harder than any slap could. Richard's breath clouded in the cold air. "I came to take you home," he said quietly. Ethan looked up at him, eyes red but defiant. "Home? You mean that museum where no one talks to each other? Where love is just another investment?" The words twisted like a knife in Richard's chest. He opened his mouth but found nothing to say. Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his jeans. "You know what's funny? I used to look up to you. I thought you were a hero, someone who built his own destiny. But now I just see a man who built walls so thick even he got trapped inside." A car sped by, its headlights washing over their faces. Richard finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You think I don't care? Everything I've ever done was for you." Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad. Everything you did was for you. You wanted power, not a family. You wanted control, not love." Richard's breath caught. The silence that followed was suffocating. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said after a while, softer now, almost pleading. "When your mother died, I promised myself I'd never let anyone make me feel that powerless again. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built something unshakable, you'd be safe." Ethan's expression softened, just a little. "But safe from what, Dad?" "From being human." The question struck something deep in Richard. Something long buried under years of ambition and pride. He looked at his son. Really looked at him. And saw the boy he used to read bedtime stories to, the boy who once drew pictures of their family and taped them to the fridge. And now here he was, grown, bruised, but still holding on to the only thing Richard had lost long ago: compassion. Richard's voice broke. "Ethan, I'm sorry." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he gave a faint, sad smile. "I know you are. But sorry doesn't fix what's broken." He turned to leave. "Ethan, wait." Ethan stopped but didn't face him. "Come back," Richard said. "Please, we can talk. We can fix this." You'll what?" Ethan said without turning. "Buy me forgiveness. Donate to a shelter and call it redemption." Richard's voice faltered. "No, I'll listen." That made Ethan pause. Slowly, he turned around. The anger in his eyes had faded, replaced by something quieter. Sadness, maybe even hope. "You'll listen?" he repeated. Richard nodded. "If you'll let me." A silence settled again, but this one was different. Less cold, more uncertain. Ethan finally sighed and walked toward the diner behind him. "Fine. 1 cup of coffee. But I'm not going back to that penthouse." Richard followed him inside. The diner was small, old-fashioned, with peeling wallpaper and a humming neon sign that flickered over the window. A waitress eyed them curiously. Two men from different worlds sharing a booth. They sat opposite each other. The silence stretched as the waitress poured their coffee. Richard wrapped his hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. Ethan spoke first. "You remember Mom used to bring us to places like this?" Richard looked down. "I remember. She said real people live here. People who work hard, who laugh even when life's unfair." Ethan smiled faintly. "I get it now. You can't see the world from the top floor of a glass tower." Richard didn't respond. His mind was spinning. Every word his son spoke felt like a mirror forcing him to confront a truth he'd long ignored. After a pause, Richard asked quietly, "Where have you been staying?" Ethan looked away. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." Ethan hesitated. "With some volunteers downtown. We're helping out at the shelter you never funded." Richard winced. "And you're happy doing that?" he asked softly. Ethan's eyes met his. For the first time in years, yeah. Something inside Richard broke then. Not out of anger, but out of realization. His son had found meaning not in money, but in service. Something he himself had never truly understood. Outside, snow began to fall softly against the window, blanketing the world in white. Richard stared at his reflection in the glass. The lines on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, and whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe it's time I see what you see." Ethan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Richard turned back to him, and for the first time, his voice carried no pride, no authority. Only sincerity. "Take me there," he said quietly. "To the shelter." Ethan blinked, surprised. You'd actually go?" "I think it's time I learned what kind of man I've become," Richard said. "And maybe, what kind of father I still could be." The car ride was silent. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window as the city's glittering towers gave way to cracked sidewalks and dimly lit alleys. Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly, his pulse loud in his ears. He'd driven these streets before, but always with tinted windows and the comfort of distance. This time there was no barrier. Every broken sign, every shivering figure under a blanket, pressed against him like a truth he could no longer ignore. They stopped in front of an old brick building with a flickering sign that read, "Haven House. Free meals and shelter." It was small, worn down, but alive. Laughter and conversation spilled faintly through the cracks in the door, mingling with the aroma of soup and coffee. Ethan stepped out first. "This is it," he said, his tone flat. "Where the people you call sob stories come for warmth." Richard followed, hesitating at the entrance. His polished shoes sank slightly into the slush, a subtle reminder that this was foreign ground. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The shelter buzzed with motion. Volunteers moving quickly between tables, distributing steaming bowls of soup. A little girl in a tattered pink coat clutched a paper cup of cocoa, smiling shyly as a young woman refilled it. There was exhaustion here, yes. But also kindness. A shared heartbeat of humanity that no skyscraper could contain. Ethan greeted a few people with warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Lee. How's your knee?" he asked one woman, who smiled and patted his hand. Richard stood awkwardly by the door, out of place among the chaos. A man with worn clothes and a kind face approached him. "You new here?" Before Richard could answer, Ethan turned. "Yeah," he said dryly. "First day, be nice Tom, he's my dad." Tom raised an eyebrow, studying the well-dressed stranger. "Your dad, huh? So this is the rich guy you've been talking about?" Ethan sighed. "Yeah, that's him." Tom chuckled softly and extended a hand. "Well, rich or not, welcome to Haven House. You look like you could use some purpose." Richard blinked, caught off guard. He shook the man's hand. "Maybe I could." Tom smiled and motioned toward the kitchen. "Grab an apron. We're short on hands." Richard hesitated, staring at the pile of worn aprons hanging on the wall. For a man who'd spent decades commanding boardrooms, the idea of serving soup to strangers felt absurd, and yet, strangely right. He slipped one over his suit, earning a small smirk from Ethan. In the kitchen, heat and noise enveloped him. Volunteers moved with practiced rhythm, ladling soup, slicing bread, washing dishes. Richard tried to keep up, fumbling at first, spilling a few drops of broth as he handed out bowls. "Don't worry, rookie," Tom called out. "Everyone spills something on their first day." Richard gave a stiff smile, wiping his hands. He glanced at Ethan across the room, laughing with a group of kids as he passed out fruit. The sight stirred something unfamiliar. Envy, maybe even pride. After an hour, his back ached, his hands were sore, and his expensive watch had soup stains. But for the first time in years, He didn't feel the crushing weight of success. Or the loneliness of power. He just felt real. He carried a tray to one of the tables, where an elderly man sat hunched over his bowl. The man looked up, his eyes wary but kind. "Thank you, son," he said softly. Richard froze at the word son. No one had called him that in decades. "You're welcome," he murmured. The old man studied him. "You don't belong here, do you?" "I'm trying to," Richard admitted. The man nodded knowingly. "Then you're already halfway there." Richard didn't understand what he meant. But the words lingered. Later, as the rush slowed, Ethan approached him. "Didn't think you'd last an hour," he said with a teasing grin. Richard gave a tired chuckle. "Neither did I," he paused. "But I get it now. Why you do this." Ethan's expression softened. "Do you?" Richard looked around. The faces, the laughter, the shared gratitude. "It's not about money. It's about dignity. About giving people a chance to feel seen." Ethan nodded slowly. "Mom used to say that." They both fell silent. The mention of her brought back memories. The warmth of her laughter. The way she used to bring blankets to the homeless in winter. She'd been the heart of their home. When she died, Richard had built walls to protect himself. But those same walls had kept everyone else out. "I failed her," Richard whispered. "And I failed you." Ethan looked down, fighting the emotion in his eyes. "It's not too late, Dad. But words aren't enough. You've got to do something." Richard straightened. "Then I will. Starting with this place." Ethan frowned. "Don't just write a check." "I'm not talking about a check," Richard said firmly. "I'm talking about building something that lasts. Real funding. A network of shelters, run by people like you, not corporations." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, unsure whether to believe him. "Dad, you mean that?" "I do," Richard said. "If you'll help me." The two stood there, years of distance between them shrinking for the first time. Just then, Tom called out from across the room. "Hey, Hale. There's a man outside asking for help. Says his truck broke down and he's freezing." Ethan rushed toward the door, with Richard close behind. Outside, the wind howled. A man stood hunched beside a rusted pickup, his hands trembling from the cold. Ethan moved to help him, but as the man looked up, Richard froze. He recognized that face. "Wet," he whispered. "That's..." The man's eyes widened in shock. Richard's past had just walked straight into the shelter. It was one of his former employees. The one he'd fired years ago, unjustly, to save a contract. And now, he was homeless. Forgotten sins as Richard stared at the man before him. The years had changed him. His once neatly trimmed beard was now rough and gray, his clothes torn, his hands cracked from cold and labor. But there was no mistaking those eyes. "Michael." Richard's voice came out as a whisper. The man blinked, disbelief and bitterness crossing his face. "Well, look who it is. Richard Hale, the king himself." Ethan looked between them, confused. "You know him?" Richard's throat tightened. "Hay used to work for me." "Used to?" Michael repeated, his voice sharp as ice. "Until you decided I was a liability." Ethan's gaze snapped to his father. "What's he talking about?" Richard couldn't answer. The wind bit through his coat, but the cold he felt came from inside. Michael stepped closer, his breath misting in the air. "You remember, don't you? 10 years ago. The construction division. You accused me of leaking documents to a rival firm." Richard swallowed hard. "You did leak them." "The evidence?" "There was no evidence." Michael's voice cracked with fury. "You didn't even listen. You just needed someone to blame after your deal went south." "I lost everything, Hale. My job, my home, my family." Ethan's heart sank as he turned toward his father. "Dad, tell me that's not true." Richard opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He remembered that day. The panic of losing a major contract, the whispers of betrayal within his company, the fear that his empire might crumble. And yes, he'd needed a scapegoat. He'd chosen Michael. Richard looked down. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I didn't know how much it cost you." Michael laughed bitterly. "You didn't care. You had your empire to protect. I tried to rebuild. But once your lawyers were done with me, no one would hire me again. I ended up driving trucks. Then that fell apart too. You didn't just take my career, Hale. You took my life." Ethan's jaw clenched. "And now he's out here freezing while you sit in a penthouse." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Richard stepped closer, his voice shaking. "Michael, I can't change what I did. But I can try to make it right." Michael scoffed. "You think a check fixes 10 years of hell?" "No," Richard said softly. I think humility might. For a moment, both men stood there, the wind roaring between them. Then Richard did something no one expected. He took off his coat and wrapped it around Michael's shoulders. The sight stunned everyone, even Ethan. I destroyed your dignity once, Richard said quietly. But I won't take away your humanity again. Michael stared at him speechless. His hands gripped the coat, trembling. The anger in his eyes flickered into confusion, then pain. Ethan watched in silence, something shifting in his chest. He'd never seen his father so small, so human. Come inside, Richard said. Please. Let's talk where it's warm. Michael hesitated, then finally nodded. Together, they stepped back into the shelter. The warmth hit them like a wave. Volunteers turned to stare. Some recognizing the millionaire who'd once made headlines, now walking shoulder to shoulder with a homeless man. Tom raised an eyebrow. You good, Hale? Richard nodded faintly. Just facing an old mistake. They sat at a small table in the corner. Ethan watched quietly as his father and Michael faced each other under the dim glow of the shelter lights. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Richard broke the silence. You were a good worker, Michael. One of the best. I should have believed you. But I let fear decide for me. I was so obsessed with control that I forgot what trust meant. Michael's eyes glistened, but his voice remained sharp. And now, you found your conscience after all this time? Richard nodded. Maybe too late for me. But not for you. He leaned forward. I can't undo what happened. But if you'll let me, I want to help you rebuild. A real job, a home, whatever it takes. Michael looked away, struggling to breathe evenly. You think I can just forgive you? Richard shook his head. No, I don't expect you to. I just want you to know I see you now. Not as an employee. As a man. Tears welled in Michael's eyes, tears of anger, grief, exhaustion. Then, with a shaky exhale, he whispered, You ruined me, Hale. But maybe this world doesn't need more hate. He stood slowly, extending a trembling hand. I can't forget. But I can start forgiving. Richard took his hand, his voice breaking. Thank you. The handshake was brief, but it carried the weight of 10 years of regret. Ethan watched, his chest tight. The father he'd hated for so long was finally becoming the man he'd always wanted him to be. Later that evening, after Michael had been given a warm meal and a cot, Ethan and Richard walked outside again. The snow had stopped, leaving the streets quiet and still. I didn't know that about you, Ethan said softly. Richard looked down. Guilt and fatigue etched into his face. There's a lot you don't know about me. But I think it's time I start changing that. Ethan's voice trembled. You really meant what you said? About the shelters? Richard nodded. Yes. But I don't just want to build buildings, Ethan. I want to build hope. And I can't do it alone. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled at his father, small, hesitant, but real. Then let's do it together. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes soft. Together. And for the first time, father and son stood side by side. Not as millionaire and heir, but as two broken men finally learning to heal. But fate wasn't finished with them yet. As they turned back toward the shelter, a black car rolled slowly to a stop across the street. A tinted window lowered, revealing a familiar face from Richard's company. His ruthless business partner. Victor Lang. He smirked as he watched them. Looks like Richard Hale's gone soft, he murmured. That's going to cost us everything. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, melting the last traces of snow. But inside Richard Hale's world, a storm was brewing. The moment he entered the sleek, glass tower of Hale Industries, whispers followed him down the hall. Assistants exchanged nervous glances, executives murmured behind closed doors. The news had already spread. Someone had taken photos outside the shelter the night before. A millionaire in a soup-stained apron, serving the homeless, wrapping his coat around a vagrant. Richard stepped into the boardroom. 12 faces turned toward him. Cold, calculating. At the head sat Victor Lang, his long-time partner, impeccably dressed, his smile sharp as a blade. Well. Victor began, leaning back in his chair. If it isn't St. Richard. Quite the spectacle last night. The press is eating it up. Richard met his gaze calmly. Then let them. Maybe it's time they saw something real. Victor's smile thinned. Real? You call this real? You humiliated the company, Richard. Our investors are panicking. Our stock dropped 3 points overnight. Richard sat down, unbothered. Maybe our investors should understand that integrity isn't bad for business. Victor's voice hardened. Don't get sentimental. You built this empire on strength, not sympathy. That's what made you who you are. Richard looked around the table. Familiar faces that had once looked up to him, now looking at him as though he'd lost his mind. And where has that strength gotten us? Millions in profits, sure. But how many people have we stepped on to get here? A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're losing your edge, old friend. You're letting that kid of yours fill your head with guilt. Richard's tone stayed steady. He reminded me what I lost. What we lost. He turned toward the others. We started this company with a dream, to build communities, not just towers. Somewhere along the way, greed took over. I let that happen. But it ends now. A gasps filled the room. Victor laughed under his breath. You're serious. Deadly serious. Richard replied. I'm liquidating 5% of my personal shares to fund shelters across the state. Independent, transparent, and non-profit. And yes, I'll be publicly supporting them. Victor slammed his hand on the table. You can't do that? Those shares stabilize the company? Do you have any idea what that will do to our market value? Richard stood. I don't care about market value anymore. I care about human value. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Victor's expression shifted. Calm, but deadly. If you do this, I'll call an emergency vote. You'll be ousted as CEO before the end of the week. Richard's jaw tightened. Then so be it. Victor rose to his feet, smirking. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Hale. Richard turned to leave. No, Victor. I made that mistake a long time ago. This is me fixing it. He walked out, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. Outside, the city shimmered under the morning light, but Richard felt an odd calm. For the first time in decades, he was free, from fear, from pride, from the chains of an empire built on ego. When he arrived back at the shelter that afternoon, Ethan was stacking crates of canned food. He looked up startled. You're supposed to be in meetings. I was. Richard said with a faint smile. And I quit. Ethan froze. What? You dad, that's your whole life. Richard chuckled softly. No, son. You're my life. I just forgot that for a while. Ethan didn't know what to say. His throat tightened. You really mean that? Richard nodded. Completely. I'm done chasing numbers. From now on, I'm chasing purpose. Tom overheard and grinned. Well, looks like we got ourselves a full-time volunteer. The room erupted in light laughter, and for the first time, Richard joined in genuinely. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The media caught wind of Richard's transformation. Headlines called him the billionaire with a heart. His resignation caused waves in the corporate world. Some mocked him. Others admired him, but the shelters began to grow, funded not just by his money, but by donations inspired by his story. Richard and Ethan worked side by side, painting walls, serving meals, talking to people. Each day, the distance between them shrank, replaced by something stronger than pride, love reborn through humility. One night, after closing up, Richard and Ethan sat on the shelter's steps, watching the lights flicker across the street. You know, Ethan said softly, Mom would have loved this. Richard smiled sadly. I think she's the reason I found my way back. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening. You really changed, Dad. Richard looked up at the stars. No, son. I finally remembered who I was before the money made me forget. But just as peace began to settle, darkness loomed once more. The next morning, the news hit like a bombshell. Hale Industries was under investigation. Documents had leaked, revealing years of unethical practices, forged contracts, illegal labor, and bribes, all orchestrated by Victor Lang. And yet, the reports listed Richard's name as a co-conspirator. He read the headlines in disbelief. Former CEO accused of corruption and fraud. Ethan's voice trembled. They're blaming you, Dad. Richard exhaled slowly. Victor's framing me. He's cleaning house and making sure I take the fall. But what will you do?